What if revenge does not arrive with thunder, but with silence poured drop by drop into a silver goblet? What if justice does not come with the sharp edge of a blade, but with a sweet, deceptive taste upon the tongue? In the fields of Georgia in 1854, whispers would later speak of a woman named Miriam, a slave whose quiet defiance was said to flow not in words, nor in open rebellion, but in the dark tincture of a poison older than empires. It was a land heavy with heat and silence. Georgia's summer sun beat mercilessly upon the cotton rows, where sweat stung the eyes of the enslaved, and the earth itself seemed baked into stone. The big house rose above the fields like a pale fortress, its whitewashed columns catching the light as though mocking the lives that labored in its shadow. Within its walls, a family lived in excess, their wine glasses brimming while the people who harvested their wealth bent beneath lash and hunger. Miriam, they said, was no ordinary field hand. She had been brought into the big house, not for favor, but for function. Skilled with a needle and thread, quick with her hands and silent with her face, she was trusted to mend, to carry, to serve. Her movements were precise, her eyes lowered, but behind them lingered something unreadable. Some claimed she had the stillness of a lake just before a storm. Others swore she carried in her very silence a kind of weight that unsettled those who looked too long. The master of the estate, Edward Tillingham, was a man of violent indulgence. His appetite for drink was matched only by his appetite for cruelty. He delighted in the crack of the whip, in the terror of hesitation, in the way power bent spines and silenced mouths. At night, the halls of the big house rang with the echo of his laughter, deepened by the wine that stained his lips. And yet it was said he trusted Miriam. Trusted her to pour, to polish, to serve, even as his hand left marks on her arm when his temper rose. The household revolved around rituals, supper served beneath chandeliers, crystal decanters polished until they gleamed, glasses filled and refilled without pause. And Miriam always near the table, always near the wine. She moved like a shadow between the decanter and the glass, unseen except when called upon. No one thought to watch her too closely. After all, she was just a woman of service, her hands bound to duty, her will imagined broken. But there were things the family did not see. There were things that slipped into silence. In the woods beyond the fields, wild herbs and roots grew in secrecy, plants that the enslaved women whispered about when the night was heavy and no overseer lingered near. Old knowledge, carried across oceans in the memories of mothers, lingered still in the soil of Georgia. Nightshade, blackberries gleaming like beads of ink, was one such plant. The mistress of the house would have called it ornamental, something to warn children away from. But to others it was a whisper of power, a seed of retribution. Miriam's hands, so skilled at sewing and mending, knew how to gather unseen, how to tuck a sprig of leaf into her pocket without rustling the branch. At dusk, when the fields cooled and the cicadas shrieked like restless souls, she walked alone for a moment by the tree-line, her steps quiet, her gaze downward. She plucked what was needed, as though she were gathering thread or fabric, and returned with the same silence that always cloaked her. The days turned into weeks, and the household carried on in its usual theater of excess. Edward drank deeply, his sons learning his laughter, their arrogance echoing his. The clink of glass filled the dining room as often as the sound of prayers filled the chapel. But beneath the polished surface, something subtle shifted. There were nights when the master's head grew heavier sooner, when his laughter slurred into a growl, when his temper cracked more violently than usual. He blamed the wine merchant, cursed the barrels, shouted at his wife for her poor taste in choosing vintages. None thought to suspect the hands that poured the drink. In the slave quarters, however, whispers grew. Whispers of Miriam's quiet walks, of the way her gaze seemed to linger on the goblet, of the strange strength that came into her silence. Some feared her, some prayed for her, some dared to hope that her steps were guided by something larger than fate. The old ones murmured that justice might yet come, not with swords or fire, but with something smaller, slower, and more certain. One night, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, Miriam was called to pour again. The dining hall was lit by candles, their flames trembling as the wind pressed against the shutters. Edward raised his glass, the red liquid glowing like blood in the flicker of light. He drank as he always did, greedily, with a smirk. Miriam stood near the wall, her hands folded, her face unreadable. The storm outside cracked with thunder, and in that instant, the house seemed to breathe with unease. None knew then that the silence had begun to shift into something darker. None yet saw the thread that had been pulled loose, the first unraveling of the fabric of the Tillingham estate. But Miriam knew. She knew as the storm rumbled overhead, as Edward drained his glass, as the candlelight shivered upon the walls. The poison was patient, and so was she. And thus the first disturbance fell upon the house, not loud, not violent, but subtle as a shadow moving across the floor. It was the kind of disturbance that no one marked at first, the kind that hid itself until it was too late. The days that followed seemed ordinary to those who looked only at the surface. The cotton fields stretched beneath the sun. The overseer's whip cracked in its rhythm. The big house continued its rituals of dinners and laughter, prayers and punishments. But within that order, cracks began to spread, quiet as roots splitting stone. Edward Tillingham, once a man of brutish vigor, began to falter. At first, it was dismissed as the heat. The Georgia summers were punishing, and even the strongest men found themselves drained. But Miriam knew better. She saw it in the way his steps grew unsteady, the way his temper flared more sharply but burned out sooner. His voice, once booming through the halls, began to slur in the evenings. The mistress called it indulgence, the wine merchants blamed a bad cask, and the sons mocked him with cruel laughter when his hand trembled while raising his glass. But behind Miriam's lowered gaze, there was calculation. Poison was not only about death, it was about timing, about control, about weaving the threads of fate so tightly that no hand could untangle them. She understood that too much at once would draw suspicion, but a steady drop could wear down even the mightiest stone. The quarters whispered more now. The enslaved men and women watched with cautious eyes. Some dared not even breathe the thought of what might be happening, for fear the walls themselves had ears. Yet others saw Miriam's silence in a new light, not submission but purpose. An old woman named Hester, who still remembered herbs from the coast of Africa, muttered under her breath that Miriam had been chosen, that the spirits guided her hand. Hope, dangerous as fire, began to flicker among them. And in the big house, suspicion began to stir. The mistress, Margaret Tillingham, a woman of brittle pride and sharpened tongue, grew restless as her husband's health declined. She searched for someone to blame, her eyes darting toward servants, her voice rising with venom. When Edward woke one morning with a fever burning his skin, she stormed through the kitchen, her accusations slicing the air. Spoiled meat, rotten bread, negligence, she hissed. And when her eyes fell upon Miriam, still and silent as always, the mistress lingered too long in her glare. Yet Edward himself dismissed it. "She's a good girl," he muttered, waving his hand toward Miriam when Margaret whispered doubts. His arrogance blinded him. He believed so completely in his own dominance that he could not imagine betrayal rising from the very hand that poured his drink. That blindness, Miriam knew, was her cloak. But fate, once set in motion, does not stay quiet. One evening, as candles flickered low and the storm winds pressed against the windows again, Edward demanded more wine. Miriam poured, her hands steady, the dark liquid swirling into his glass. He lifted it to his lips, drained it in a single swallow, and for a moment silence held the room. Then a violent cough tore from his chest, his face flushing crimson as the goblet slipped from his grasp and shattered against the floor. The mistress screamed. The sons leapt to their feet. Miriam stood frozen in the corner, her face calm, her eyes lowered as chaos filled the hall. Edward staggered, gasping, then slumped into his chair, clutching at the table. Servants rushed forward, water was fetched, prayers muttered, but Miriam did not move until commanded. She bent, collected the shards of glass, her fingers careful, her movements as silent as the shadows. The fever lingered for days. Edward raved in his bed, sweating and trembling. His once commanding voice reduced to incoherent mutters. Margaret never left his side, her suspicion growing like a thorn in her chest. She watched the servants with hawk's eyes, her words sharp, her accusations sharper. Miriam moved quietly through it all, tending, pouring, sewing, her silence her shield. But suspicion is a living thing. It feeds on fear, it sharpens with time. The mistress began to watch Miriam more closely, her gaze following every step, every gesture. She noted the walks Miriam took at dusk, the small bundle she sometimes carried. She began to question the cooks about herbs, about roots, about strange tastes in the food. Fear had taken root in the big house, and it spread like fire through dry grass. In the quarters, the whispers deepened into a murmur of awe. Some believed Miriam untouchable, cloaked in the protection of something greater than man. Others feared she was doomed, that the mistress's suspicion would soon bring the lash or the noose. But all knew one thing: the balance of power had shifted, however slightly. For the first time, the master's body had betrayed him, and in that weakness, the enslaved saw the faintest outline of justice. One night, as Miriam returned from the tree-line with her quiet bundle of leaves, she found Hester waiting in the shadows. The old woman's eyes were sharp, her voice a rasp. "Child," she whispered, "what you carry can kill a man, but it can also kill you if they see. Are you certain of this path?" Miriam's gaze held steady, her silence unbroken. She did not need words. The fire in her eyes spoke for her. Hester nodded slowly, as though recognizing a destiny already written. "Then may the ancestors guide you," she murmured, stepping aside. The storm clouds thickened again over Georgia, heavy and unrelenting. Inside the big house, Edward's decline grew more visible. He coughed blood now, his hands shook violently. His temper snapped like brittle wood. And through it all, Miriam poured his wine, her movements unchanged, her face unreadable. But the mistress was watching too closely. And in her watchfulness lay danger. For silence, however powerful, cannot shield forever when suspicion hardens into certainty. The noose of fate was tightening. The question was not whether Miriam would act again, but when, and whether she could remain unseen as she did. The fever that gripped Edward Tillingham no longer came and went. It consumed him now, day and night, leaving his body weaker, his mind more fractured. What once was a towering man who ruled with iron will was now a figure hunched in his bed, coughing, cursing, sweating. His decline was a shadow over the big house, and everyone felt its weight. Yet in that shadow, Margaret Tillingham grew sharper, colder, her suspicion no longer hidden. She accused the cooks of spoiling meat, the stable boys of bringing disease from the fields, the washerwomen of carrying filth into the linens. But no matter how loudly she accused others, her gaze always returned to Miriam. Miriam felt it, like the prick of a thorn in her skin, constant and unrelenting. Each time she entered the master's chamber with a tray of wine, Margaret's eyes followed her hand. Each time she bent to gather sheets or pour water, Margaret's lips tightened. Miriam moved with the same calm she always had, her silence unbroken, but she knew the mistress was circling closer. One evening, when the air outside was thick with heat and thunder rolled far in the distance, Margaret acted. She ordered all the servants into the hall, her voice sharp as a blade. Edward lay groaning upstairs, too weak to rise, and Margaret stood at the foot of the staircase, her pale face lit by a single candle. "Something in this house is poisoning my husband," she hissed. Her eyes scanned the gathered slaves, their faces lowered, bodies tense. "And I will find out who." The silence was suffocating. A baby whimpered in its mother's arms, and Margaret's glare silenced even that. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "From this day forward," she declared, "nothing enters my husband's chamber without my eyes upon it. Every drop, every crumb, every cloth." Her words were not idle. From that night on, Margaret stationed herself by Edward's side, a sentinel in silks and fury. If Miriam poured wine, Margaret demanded the first sip. If Miriam washed sheets, Margaret inspected them for stains. If Miriam carried food, Margaret pressed her nose close, searching for any bitter scent. For Miriam, the cloak of invisibility was gone. Each step, each motion carried danger now. Yet she did not falter. Nightshade was her weapon, but patience was her shield. She could not act recklessly, not while Margaret's suspicion was sharp enough to cut. Still fate pressed forward. Edward's condition worsened, and fear gripped the household. Physicians came and went, shaking their heads, muttering about fever and consumption. They bled him, they forced him to drink bitter tonics, they prayed over him. Nothing slowed the poison's grip. One physician, a man with kind eyes but trembling hands, pulled Margaret aside after a long examination. "Madam," he said softly, "I fear your husband's ailment is not natural." Margaret's lips tightened. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, lowering his voice further. "This is no fever of the body. This is the hand of something foreign. Perhaps poison." The word struck like lightning. Margaret's face hardened into stone. That night she did not sleep. She sat upright beside Edward's bed, her eyes burning into Miriam as she moved about the chamber. Miriam felt the weight of that gaze, heavier than chains. Every motion had to be precise, unshaken, unreadable. And then came the test. Margaret ordered Miriam to pour Edward's wine as always. But when Miriam raised the jug, Margaret's hand shot out and seized it. "Pour for me first," she commanded, her voice trembling with fury. The room froze. Edward, too delirious to care, muttered incoherently on the bed. Miriam held the jug steady, her face calm, though her heart pounded like drums in her chest. She poured into a separate goblet, the dark liquid swirling. Margaret's eyes never left her. The mistress lifted the glass, her lips brushing its rim. For a heartbeat, Miriam thought she might drink, and the entire careful plan would unravel. But Margaret hesitated. She studied the wine, sniffed it, swirled it. Then, with a sharp gesture, she thrust it into Miriam's hands. "Drink," she ordered. The silence was absolute. Every servant in the chamber held their breath. Miriam lifted the goblet slowly, her eyes downcast. And then, in one smooth motion, she tilted it to her lips and drank. The wine burned on her tongue, but there was no poison tonight. Miriam had known the mistress might test her, and so she had poured only from the untainted jug. She swallowed calmly, lowered the cup, and bowed her head. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had not caught her. Not yet. But the danger had sharpened to a knife's edge. In the quarters, whispers grew louder. Some urged Miriam to stop, fearing the mistress's wrath would soon bring death upon them all. Others begged her to continue, seeing Edward's failing body as proof that justice was close at hand. And Miriam herself. She remained unshaken, her silence her answer. One night, under the veil of darkness, Miriam returned to the woods. The nightshade plants waited, their deadly berries glistening like drops of ink beneath the moonlight. She gathered them with careful hands, her heart steady. She knew the risks. She knew Margaret's eyes were sharper than ever, the noose of suspicion tightening. But she also knew this: Edward Tillingham's days were numbered. The storm that had been building for weeks was about to break.